"Don't move a single hand until I tell you to," the officer said, and in that instant, the entire night seemed to lose its temperature as the flashing red and blue lights painted the wet street in restless color while a black sedan slowed to a complete stop beneath the pouring rain on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, where Marcus Johnson kept both hands visible on the steering wheel and his wife Aisha Johnson sat quietly beside him holding a small black case resting on her lap as if it weighed more than its size suggested. Officer Daniel Reed approached from the driver's side with slow, deliberate steps that carried the certainty of someone who believed he already understood everything he needed to know about the people inside the car, his flashlight cutting across the windshield, lingering a second too long on Marcus's face before shifting to Aisha, then down to the sealed case that immediately drew his attention without a word being spoken. "License and registration," Reed said flatly, not as a request but as a command that filled the space between rain droplets striking the pavement, and Marcus responded calmly, reaching for the glove compartment with steady movements that avoided any sudden motion while Aisha adjusted her posture slightly, keeping the case secure but visible as if it was the only thing in the car that demanded careful attention. The street behind them was empty except for the occasional passing vehicle that slowed briefly before continuing on, unaware that this moment had already begun to tighten into something heavier than a routine traffic stop, something shaped by assumptions that neither Marcus nor Aisha had invited but both immediately recognized. Reed glanced back toward his patrol car where his partner waited, then returned his focus to the couple, his expression unchanged but his tone sharpening just enough to suggest impatience building beneath procedure. "Where are you coming from tonight?" he asked, and Marcus answered without hesitation, explaining they had been visiting family across town, though Reed's eyes never fully settled on the answer, instead drifting again to the case as though it represented a question he preferred not to ask directly. Aisha remained silent, her fingers resting lightly along the edge of the case, her breathing controlled, her gaze lowered but alert in a way that suggested she was measuring every second carefully rather than reacting to it. The rain intensified for a brief moment, tapping against the roof of the car in a steady rhythm that made the silence inside feel even more deliberate, and when Reed finally spoke again his voice carried a colder edge, the kind that often arrived when patience turned into presumption. "Step out of the vehicle for a moment," he said, and Marcus paused just long enough to exchange a glance with Aisha, a silent communication passing between them that did not require words, before both complied calmly, opening their doors with no urgency, stepping into the wet air where the streetlights reflected off the pavement like fractured glass. Reed moved slightly closer, his attention still anchored to the case as Aisha held it steady in both hands, and for reasons not yet spoken or understood, the night seemed to narrow further, as if something beneath the surface of this encounter was waiting for a detail to reveal itself that would change the direction of everything that followed. The rain had not stopped, but it had softened into a steady curtain that blurred the edges of the streetlights as Marcus Johnson stood beside the driver's side door with his hands relaxed but visible, his posture steady in a way that suggested patience rather than compliance, while Aisha Johnson remained just behind him holding the black case closer to her body as Officer Daniel Reed circled them with the slow precision of someone who believed time itself was an extension of authority. Reed's flashlight shifted between their faces and the case repeatedly, each pass growing more intentional, as if he was trying to place them into a category that already existed in his mind before the stop even began. "You two live around here?" he asked, though his tone carried less curiosity and more evaluation, and Marcus responded evenly, giving a simple confirmation that they lived about 20 minutes away, nothing unusual, nothing uncertain, yet Reed did not seem satisfied with ordinary answers. Behind them, the patrol car door opened slightly and a second officer stepped out, observing without speaking, adding another layer of attention to a situation that had not yet produced any wrongdoing but had already created tension in the silence. Aisha adjusted her grip on the case again, and Reed immediately noticed the movement, his gaze narrowing just enough to signal that the object had become the center of his focus even if no one had named it aloud. "What is inside the case?" he asked, this time more directly, and the question hung in the air longer than necessary, blending with the sound of tires passing on a distant road and the soft hiss of rain hitting asphalt. Marcus looked at Aisha briefly before answering, his voice calm but careful, explaining that it was personal documentation, nothing harmful, nothing illegal, but Reed's expression did not change, as though he had already decided that uncertainty itself was reason enough to continue. Aisha finally spoke for the first time, her voice controlled and clear, saying only that the case contained identification materials that required proper handling, not because she was trying to challenge authority but because she understood the importance of precision, and the moment she spoke Reed's attention sharpened further, his eyes locking onto her with a kind of suspicion that suggested her calmness itself felt unusual to him. He raised his radio slightly, speaking in a low voice to dispatch, giving their location and plate number while describing the situation in minimal terms, though the phrasing carried subtle implication rather than fact. Marcus remained still, his hands never leaving view, while Aisha's gaze dropped briefly to the wet pavement before returning forward, her expression unchanged but thoughtful, as if she was weighing not the officer's words but the structure of the moment itself. Reed stepped closer again, now within a few feet of the case, and the rain between them seemed louder as if the space had tightened, and when he asked them to place the case on the hood of the car his tone carried finality rather than request, signaling a shift from observation to control. Aisha hesitated for only a second before carefully lifting the case forward, placing it on the vehicle with deliberate care, and in that moment the entire interaction seemed to pause, not because anything had resolved, but because something had begun to shift beneath the surface of what everyone assumed they were seeing. The black case rested on the hood of the patrol car as if it had always belonged there, its matte surface collecting scattered drops of rain that slid downward in slow, uneven paths while Officer Daniel Reed stood just close enough to see every detail but not close enough to touch it, his posture rigid with a kind of controlled skepticism that had not yet found a reason to relax. Marcus Johnson remained beside Aisha Johnson, both of them still and composed, their presence quiet but grounded, as Reed studied the case longer than necessary, his flashlight now lowered as if instinctively respecting the object without understanding why. The second officer behind him shifted his weight slightly, glancing between Reed and the couple, sensing the change in atmosphere but not speaking, allowing the silence to stretch in a way that made even passing cars feel distant. Reed finally reached forward, not opening the case yet, but placing his hand near the latch as if confirming it was real, and when he did, Aisha's voice remained steady as she said the case required proper authorization before being accessed, her tone neither defensive nor emotional, only precise, and that precision seemed to irritate something unspoken in Reed's expression. Authorization for what exactly? Reed asked, his voice lower now, more measured, and Marcus answered calmly that it was federal documentation related to protected identity clearance, though he did not elaborate further, not because he was avoiding the truth but because he understood that too much explanation at the wrong moment often created more confusion than clarity. The rain intensified again briefly, tapping against the hood of the car in a rhythm that filled the space between them, and Reed glanced at his partner as if expecting confirmation that this situation still fit within routine procedure, but the partner only shrugged slightly, uncertain. Aisha finally placed her hand on top of the case, not opening it but signaling intention, and she said that the contents were registered under federal custody protocols, meaning any unauthorized access would require escalation, and as she spoke, Marcus observed Reed carefully, noticing the subtle shift in the officer's posture, the way certainty began to loosen at the edges. Reed straightened, stepping back half a pace, and called dispatch again, this time with less confidence in his voice, asking for verification on identification clearance status tied to the plate and occupants, while the couple waited without moving, their calm becoming more noticeable than any action they had taken. A few moments passed where only static filled the radio, and during that pause Reed's attention returned again to the case, but now it was different, less accusatory and more uncertain, as though he was beginning to understand that what he had assumed to be a simple stop was no longer fitting into familiar categories. Marcus spoke quietly, not challenging, only clarifying that they had followed all legal requirements and were prepared to comply with verification procedures, and that statement seemed to settle something in the air, shifting the moment away from confrontation and toward evaluation. Aisha kept her eyes forward, her hand still resting on the case, while Reed listened to dispatch finally return with a response that changed the rhythm of his breathing, and for the first time since the stop began, his focus was no longer on suspicion but on confirmation of something larger than the situation he had initiated. The moment the radio transmission finished, the entire atmosphere around the patrol car shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible at first but unmistakable in its effect. As Officer Daniel Reed stood still with his hand resting near the edge of the hood where the black case sat, his expression tightening not with suspicion now but with something closer to recalculation. The second officer beside him straightened slightly, sensing the change in tone without fully understanding its cause, while Marcus Johnson remained steady, his posture unchanged, and Aisha Johnson kept her hand lightly on top of the case as if anchoring the situation through presence rather than force. Reed did not speak immediately, his eyes fixed on the radio in his hand as if replaying what he had just heard, the confirmation or partial confirmation from dispatch settling into a space that had previously been filled with certainty. The rain continued to fall in a soft but persistent pattern, forming thin streams across the hood of the car that reflected the red and blue lights in distorted lines, and for the first time since the stop began, Reed stepped back half a pace, creating distance rather than closing it. "Say that again," he said into the radio, his voice now noticeably lower, and after a brief pause the response came back more clearly, referencing a federal identification status linked to active clearance authorization, enough detail to interrupt the narrative he had been constructing in his mind since the moment he initiated the stop. Aisha did not move, but Marcus glanced toward her briefly, not in concern but in quiet acknowledgement, as if they both understood that the situation had transitioned from evaluation to verification. Reed lowered the radio slowly, his attention returning to the case, but this time without the same intensity of assumption, as if the object had changed category in his perception without physically changing at all. The second officer stepped slightly closer, looking at Reed for direction, but Reed did not immediately provide it, instead studying the couple again with a different kind of silence, one that no longer carried confidence but uncertainty layered with recognition of procedural boundaries he could no longer ignore. "You did not mention federal clearance earlier," Reed finally said, not as an accusation but as an observation that carried the weight of procedural correction, and Marcus responded calmly that they had followed all standard protocol for interaction and had not intended to escalate or complicate the stop, only to comply fully if required. Aisha then spoke again, her voice even and controlled, clarifying that the case contained restricted credentials that were only to be accessed under verified authorization channels, and that any delay in confirmation was expected due to system processing times, not resistance or concealment. Reed listened without interrupting, and as she spoke, something in his posture softened slightly, not in defeat but in the quiet recognition that the framework he had been operating within was no longer fully aligned with the information now in front of him. The radio crackled again with a final confirmation, more explicit than before, and this time Reed did not ask for repetition. He simply listened, then exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering toward the hood of the car where the case remained untouched, its significance no longer defined by suspicion but by context he had not initially been aware of. The silence that followed was different from before, no longer charged with confrontation, but instead shaped by recalibration, as Marcus and Aisha remained composed under the shifting weight of understanding, while the night around them continued unchanged, indifferent to the quiet reversal unfolding in the space between authority and recognition. The confirmation from dispatch settled into the air like a weight being carefully placed on a scale that had already been unstable for too long, and in that quiet shift Officer Daniel Reed stood motionless for a moment longer than expected, his eyes no longer scanning for suspicion but absorbing the implications of what had just been verified. The black case on the hood of the patrol car now felt different in his perception, not because it had changed in form, but because its meaning had been reassigned by authority beyond his immediate control. Marcus Johnson remained still beside Aisha Johnson, neither of them speaking, their composure unchanged as if they had anticipated this transition long before it arrived, while the second officer shifted his stance slightly, lowering his hand from his radio as the need for escalation faded into procedural acknowledgement. Reed finally lowered his voice as he spoke, not toward the couple but toward his partner, instructing him to stand down the active inquiry, and the words carried a tone that was not defeat, but adjustment to new boundaries. The partner responded with a brief nod, stepping back half a pace, his attention now observational rather than investigative. Aisha slowly lifted her hand from the case, not hurriedly, but with the calm precision of someone who understood that the moment of scrutiny had passed into verification, and Marcus exhaled quietly, though his posture remained unchanged, steady and controlled. Reed looked at the couple again, this time with a different focus, his expression no longer shaped by assumption but by reassessment, as if he was seeing the same scene through a revised frame that had only just been provided to him. "This is confirmed federal clearance status," he said slowly, more to himself than to them, as though acknowledging the boundary that had just been crossed from discretionary judgment into institutional recognition. The rain continued to fall with the same steady rhythm, but the tension it had carried earlier seemed to dissipate into the environment, replaced by a quieter stillness that now defined the space between them. Marcus gave a small nod, not as validation of authority, but as acknowledgement of resolution, while Aisha remained composed, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, as if the outcome had simply aligned with what was already known. Reed took a step back from the vehicle entirely, creating a clear physical distance from the case, and adjusted his radio again, speaking in a lower tone to finalize the status update, confirming that the stop was now under federal verification acknowledgement and no further action was required. The second officer relaxed his posture further, glancing briefly at Reed before looking away toward the empty road, the urgency that had defined the earlier moments now fully replaced by procedural closure. For a brief moment, no one spoke, and the only sound was the rain striking the pavement and the faint hum of passing air in the distance, as if the world itself had resumed its normal rhythm after a disruption that had quietly resolved itself. Reed finally looked at Marcus and Aisha again, his expression controlled but noticeably subdued, and he stated in a calm voice that they were free to proceed when ready, the words formal but carrying a tone that suggested acknowledgement of misalignment rather than confrontation. Marcus responded with a simple thank you, steady and without emphasis, and Aisha gave a slight nod, her hand returning to the case only as a natural motion of securing it rather than reacting to the officer. The atmosphere no longer carried tension, but the residue of it remained in the stillness between them, as if the night itself was remembering what had just shifted without fully recording why. The patrol lights dimmed slightly as the black sedan finally began to move forward, tires rolling slowly over the wet asphalt with a soft sound that blended into the steady rhythm of rain, while Marcus Johnson kept both hands on the wheel and focused straight ahead, his breathing even and controlled as if the weight of the moment had not left him but had simply changed form. Beside him, Aisha Johnson held the black case on her lap again, no longer as something concealed or questioned, but as something that had already been acknowledged and understood, her fingers resting lightly along its edge in a calm, deliberate way. Behind them, in the fading reflection of the rearview mirror, the figure of Officer Daniel Reed remained still on the roadside, his posture no longer rigid with authority but softened into something quieter, more uncertain, as the second officer stood near him without speaking, both of them watching the vehicle depart without any attempt to follow or re-engage. The rain continued to fall in a consistent pattern, washing over the streetlights and stretching their reflections across the road like blurred lines that no longer carried urgency, and as the sedan increased its distance from the stop, the environment itself seemed to return to a neutral state, as if the night had simply absorbed what had just occurred without marking it loudly. Inside the car, silence settled between Marcus and Aisha, not uncomfortable, but reflective, shaped by the understanding that some moments did not require immediate explanation in order to be fully recognized. Marcus glanced briefly at Aisha, then back to the road, his expression calm but thoughtful, while Aisha adjusted her posture slightly, looking down at the case for a moment before lifting her gaze forward again, as if confirming internally that everything had concluded exactly as it was meant to. There was no celebration in their demeanor, no visible reaction of relief or tension, only a steady presence that suggested familiarity with situations where perception and reality often needed time to align. The city around them continued its quiet movement, distant headlights passing through intersections, occasional silhouettes of buildings fading into the mist, all of it unchanged by the brief intersection of authority and misunderstanding that had just resolved behind them. In the distance, Officer Reed remained where he was, his attention no longer on the road but on the space where the vehicle had been moments earlier, his thoughts not spoken aloud, his posture now less about enforcement and more about reflection. As the second officer turned slightly toward him but did not initiate conversation, allowing the silence between them to remain intact. For Reed, there was no immediate conclusion that could fully define what had occurred, only the lingering awareness that assumptions made too quickly could shift the direction of any interaction long before facts were fully understood. The radio on his shoulder remained quiet now, no longer carrying updates or confirmations, only static and standby silence, while the rain continued to blur the edges of the scene until even the memory of urgency began to soften. Marcus drove steadily through the next intersection, the road opening ahead of them without obstruction, while Aisha finally leaned back slightly in her seat, still holding the case but no longer gripping it with tension, her expression calm in a way that suggested closure without need for further acknowledgement. The night returned to its ordinary rhythm, vehicles passing at measured intervals, streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement, and the space behind them slowly dissolving into distance, leaving only the quiet understanding that what had just unfolded would remain present not in action, but in memory. The sedan moved through the quiet stretch of road with a steady rhythm, the windshield wipers tracing slow arcs across the glass as Marcus Johnson kept his focus forward and Aisha Johnson sat beside him in calm silence, the black case resting securely on her lap like a resolved truth that no longer needed defense. The city lights outside passed in softened streaks, reflecting off wet pavement and distant storefront windows, creating a calm contrast to the tension that had defined the earlier moments. Inside the car, neither of them spoke at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because the meaning of what had just happened required time to settle beyond words. Marcus eventually exhaled slowly, his grip on the steering wheel loosening slightly as he adjusted his posture, glancing briefly toward Aisha before returning his eyes to the road ahead. Aisha kept her gaze forward, her expression steady, but there was a subtle shift in her composure, as if the weight she had carried into that traffic stop had now been acknowledged by forces beyond the immediate moment. Behind them, far in the distance, the patrol lights were no longer visible, and Officer Daniel Reid stood near his vehicle in a posture that was no longer defined by authority, but by reflection. The second officer remained nearby, speaking softly into his radio, confirming final procedural closure, while Reid listened without interruption, his attention no longer on enforcement but on understanding the implications of what had unfolded. The rain continued at a steady pace, softening the edges of the street and muting the sound of passing vehicles, and in that environment, the absence of urgency felt more pronounced than its presence had been earlier. Marcus broke the silence in the car with a quiet observation, not directed at blame or conclusion, but at the reality of how quickly perception could shift when information changed, and Aisha responded with a calm acknowledgement, noting that such transitions were part of the environment they operated in, where clarity often arrived after judgment had already been formed and then corrected. As they continued driving, the road ahead opened into a wider stretch, illuminated by evenly spaced streetlights that cast long reflections across the asphalt, and the atmosphere inside the vehicle remained steady, grounded in composure rather than reaction. In contrast, at the side of the stop, Reid stood for a moment longer than necessary, his hands resting near his belt as he looked at the empty space where the sedan had been, the moment replaying in his mind not as a failure, but as a reminder of procedural limits intersecting with information he had not initially possessed. The second officer eventually moved toward the patrol car, preparing to resume normal duties, while Reid slowly turned away from the road, his posture now neutral, neither tense nor commanding, but contemplative in a way that suggested internal recalibration. The radio on his shoulder remained quiet, the earlier urgency replaced by administrative confirmation, and the rain continued to wash over the scene, erasing footprints, reflections, and the last visible trace of the interaction. Marcus drove without urgency, maintaining steady speed as traffic signals changed ahead, while Aisha finally adjusted the case slightly, ensuring it was secure, her movements minimal and deliberate, as if reaffirming stability rather than responding to change. The interior of the car remained quiet, but the silence no longer carried uncertainty, only continuity, as both of them understood that the situation had moved fully from confrontation to resolution. Behind them, the city resumed its ordinary rhythm without interruption, unaware of the quiet correction that had taken place within a single moment on a rain-soaked road, leaving only the lingering awareness that understanding and assumption rarely arrive at the same time. The highway widened as Marcus Johnson continued driving northbound with steady control, the tires of the sedan humming softly against the damp asphalt while the last traces of rain began to thin into a light mist that hovered over the road like a fading memory of the earlier storm. Inside the car, the atmosphere had fully settled into calm, not the calm of avoidance, but the calm of completion, where no further explanation was required because understanding had already taken its place. Aisha Johnson sat with the black case resting securely on her lap, her hands no longer tense, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested the situation had transitioned entirely out of uncertainty. Marcus glanced briefly at her before returning his attention to the road, his expression composed, reflecting not surprise or relief, but acceptance of how quickly perception could shift when information was incomplete at the start and clarified only later. Behind them, the city they had passed through earlier now felt distant, its lights scattered along the horizon, blending into the night as they moved farther away from the intersection where authority and assumption had briefly collided. In that space behind them, Officer Daniel Reed remained at the roadside location for a few moments longer than necessary, his vehicle parked at an angle near the curb while the second officer finalized procedural notes over the radio in a calm and standard tone. Reed stood still, his gaze fixed on the empty stretch of road where the sedan had disappeared, not in pursuit of anything, but in thought, as if reviewing the sequence of events not to challenge it, but to understand the structure behind it. There was no urgency in his posture now, only reflection, a quiet acknowledgement that the boundaries he had operated within had shifted during the course of the interaction without resistance, only correction. The second officer eventually returned to the vehicle, closing the door and signaling readiness to resume patrol duties, while Reed took a final moment before following, his movements slower than before, measured in a way that suggested the incident had left an imprint not of conflict, but of recalibration. On the highway, Marcus maintained a consistent speed, merging smoothly with traffic as the road signs passed in regular intervals illuminated by overhead lights that cast long reflections across the wet surface. Aisha adjusted her seat slightly, still holding the case, but now with the ease of someone who no longer needed to verify its importance, because its recognition had already been established externally. She looked forward. Quietly, her expression calm, and after a brief silence she spoke in a low voice, noting that situations like the one they had just experienced often resolved themselves once proper channels confirmed what initial perception could not, and Marcus nodded slightly in agreement without taking his eyes off the road. The interior of the car remained still, filled only with the soft sound of tires and wind moving past the frame of the vehicle, and in that stillness there was no tension left to resolve, only continuity. Far behind them, the location of the traffic stop faded completely into the night, the patrol lights no longer visible, the officers no longer in motion toward them, but instead returning to routine duty that no longer involved the situation that had just concluded. Reed entered the patrol car last, closing the door with a controlled movement, and for a brief moment before the vehicle pulled away, he looked once more at the empty road ahead, not as an officer assessing a scene, but as an individual processing how quickly context can redefine certainty. Then the patrol car merged back into standard traffic flow, the moment fully absorbed into the larger rhythm of the night. Ahead, Marcus and Aisha continued driving without interruption, their path steady, the black case resting securely between them as the highway stretched forward into quiet distance, carrying them beyond the incident and into the uninterrupted flow of the road ahead. The highway stretched forward in a long uninterrupted line as Marcus Johnson continued driving through the quiet stretch of early morning, the darkness of night gradually softening into the first pale hints of dawn that began to lift along the horizon, painting the sky in muted tones of gray and soft blue while the last traces of rain had completely disappeared, leaving only damp pavement reflecting the changing light. Inside the sedan, the atmosphere remained steady and unchanged, as if the events of the night had settled into memory rather than emotion, with Aisha Johnson sitting calmly beside Marcus, the black case still resting securely on her lap, no longer carrying tension or uncertainty, but simply existing as part of their routine presence. Marcus kept both hands on the steering wheel, his posture relaxed, his focus forward, and the silence between them was no longer heavy or reflective, but natural, shaped by understanding rather than reaction, as though nothing more needed to be said in order for the moment to be complete. Aisha eventually broke the silence in a quiet voice, not to revisit what had happened, but to acknowledge how quickly perception could change when context was incomplete, and Marcus nodded slightly in agreement, his eyes remaining on the road ahead as the vehicle continued at a steady, unhurried pace. Behind them, far removed from the highway and fading into the distance of memory, Officer Daniel Reed had already returned to routine patrol operations, his vehicle moving through familiar streets under standard procedure, yet his thoughts remained quieter than usual, no longer focused on enforcement or observation, but on the sequence of assumptions and corrections that had unfolded earlier in the night. He did not replay the moment with frustration, nor with resistance, but with a measured awareness that what he had encountered was not failure of protocol, but limitation of perception at the beginning of an interaction that had required information he did not initially possess. The second officer beside him maintained normal conversation about routine matters, but Reed responded minimally, his attention occasionally drifting toward the windshield where the city lights reflected faintly, as if reminding him that clarity in his profession often arrived not at the moment of decision, but after it. As dawn strengthened across the highway, Marcus adjusted his speed slightly, merging into lighter traffic as morning commuters began to appear in distant clusters, and Aisha shifted the case subtly to rest more comfortably, her expression calm and composed, her gaze forward without urgency, as if the night had fully transitioned into closure. The landscape around them widened, revealing open stretches of road bordered by trees that moved gently in the wind, their silhouettes gradually becoming more defined as daylight increased, and the sense of distance from the earlier encounter became complete, not through avoidance, but through passage of time. In the city behind them, Officer Reid completed his shift transition notes, stepping out of the patrol vehicle briefly as the morning air replaced the dampness of night, and for a moment he stood still, looking at the horizon without focus on any particular point, only acknowledging internally that the sequence of events he had been part of had ended not with escalation, but with correction and release. There was no further action required, no unresolved conflict remaining in procedure or outcome, only the quiet understanding that not every encounter begins with accurate framing, and not every conclusion arrives in the form originally expected. On the highway, Marcus and Aisha continued forward without interruption, their vehicle moving steadily into widening daylight, the road ahead clear and open, carrying them beyond the memory of flashing lights and wet pavement into a space defined only by forward motion and quiet resolution, where everything that had happened remained behind them not as tension, but as finished understanding.